have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speakers tonight, and it's a real treat. So our speaker is John Dunn, who is a renowned ornithologist. He developed a fascination with birds at just 8 years old, and that was sparked by when he first saw a male hooded oriole. He has lived most of his life in California, where he has studied and written about birds and co-authored several books, including the 7 editions of the National Geographic Field Guide to the Birds of North America. John has also served for 30 years on the California Bird Records Committee and is a member of the North American Checklist Committee of the American Ornithological Society. Today, he is co-presenting with Lara Singh, who is a 15-year-old college student at Cal State LA. She is majoring in biology with a focus on ecology and evolution and is minoring in bioinformatics. She actually gave a talk for us last year about research she did on Western bluebirds, and her work has since been published in a peer-reviewed journal. She is very interested in shorebirds, especially Dunlin, and she hopes to pursue a career as an ornithologist. I think this is a little bit of an understatement, but I think she is well on her way to achieving that goal. So John and Lara, thank you both so much for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to hear your presentation.
Well, thank you, Serena. And we're going to start with a bit of a philosophical emphasis about some things that I think are important about looking at shorebirds. How to approach them, how to learn them, how to stay with them. Too often in this day and age, with keeping eBird lists and frantically chasing every rarity, we don't take enough time to learn the shorebirds we're watching. So let's just talk about a few not only approaches for the beginner, but those that love shorebirds as I do. They're my favorite family, even though I'm really more of a passerine person, but I have a special place in my heart for shorebirds and calidris in particular. But as I say for so many things, the first thing to do at home is learn status and distribution. Learn which species are common and those that are rare, and learn where they're found and when. And you live in the Bay Area, you have many species that winter, but some are spring migrants as well, and even more occur mainly in the fall. And learn the timing, when they come through in the spring or peak, and when the first ones are coming south in the fall. With most species, the adults come south first, nearly all, followed by the juveniles. So that's over an extended period in the fall. Really, even you could say, like with Western Sandpiper, from June through October, depending upon the age. But that's homework. I know that's boring, but as Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. And indeed, the better prepared you are, the better you'll be at birding on really all aspects. Another thing about shorebirds, most people think you want to go to the place with thousands. That's not the way to learn them. Pick a place where there are many fewer than that, and where you can look at all of them, and spend time learning those. Sometimes if they're just too many, and many particularly if they're distant, that just gets overwhelming. You not only want to see them, you want to learn them. And just relax, don't worry about finding a rarity. Get utterly familiar with the regular species first. And that can't be done just once, but many times. And sometimes you're panicking because there are too many. You need to sit and relax them and look at them methodically. Next, get as close as you can to them. Find a pond or something where you just move slowly, nothing dramatic, move gradually closer. The juveniles, I've sometimes almost on a few occasions had them walk between my legs. I'm exaggerating, but they've got within a few feet. They seem incredibly tame. But in any case, get a place where you can approach very closely and have your binocular be your main tool not necessarily have a telescope in case something's a little farther away, but the binocular, if they're close, can often lead to a greater sense of appreciation. And I would add that behavior is an excellent way to learn shorebirds too, how they act, how they walk, how they probe, behavioral things. We're not talking about solitary sandpipers, but their behavior is extremely distinctive, and get to know them. So not many birds learn every bird. Sometimes a predator will go by, or they'll get alarmed by your presence and they'll get up and fly, but they will return to their feeding spot, their little micro territory in most cases. Particularly if you're onto something rare, you'll want to be able to re-find it, all of those sorts of things to assure yourself you got it correct. You know, go back to the same place. You may not see as many species, but the important thing is to learn them, and learn the common species first is essential.
Most birders hope to find rarities, and shorebirds are no exception to this tendency. However, it is essential to know the common species before trying to add something new to your list. So it's important that you know least and western sandpipers well before thinking about finding a semi-palmated. Once you have the common species down, there's some things that you need to keep in mind while finding a rarity. When you think you've found a rarity, it usually returns to the same feeding territory after being startled, so you should be able to pick it out again. If you're unable to, there's a good chance that it's not the rarity you were looking for. In any instance, it's a good idea to photograph any claim of a rarity so others can verify your identification. If there's an ambiguous bird, try to photograph the said bird so others can provide their input, and be okay with letting some birds go. The overall size and shape of a bird is important to identification, but so are more subtle features like bill size and shape and primary tip projection. More subtle marks like primary tip projection can be intimidating, but it will be addressed shortly.
So this is another boring slide, but this is homework you can do at home. Look at an accurate topographical illustration of parts of a shorebird and the way the naturally folded wing looks, and the parts of the feather groups and how you see them. And once you have this down, you can look at photos and get yourself conversant with the feather terminology. Again, boring work, but in our view, essential for learning these birds. So I always start at the rear of the bird and then work my way forward. And the first thing I always start with is primary tip projection, which may or may not extend beyond the tail. And that's the more migratory species have longer wings, which makes sense and is logical. The primary tip projection, you don't see much of the primaries. What might look like primaries are those long saber-shaped feathers, the next group up, the tertials. And they're inside of the secondaries on the spread wing. And that's really it takes up a large area on the folded wing. In some species like least, which are shorter distance migrants, there's hardly any primary tip projection. Other longer distance migrants like Baird's have long primary tip projection. So start at the rear, find the primary tip projection, then find the tertials. Your next group up are the secondary coverts, and they're divided into multiple rows. One row of greater secondary coverts, one row of medians, and multiple rows of lessers. So let's start with the greater coverts. They're going to be right up from the tertials, and they're greater in size. The median coverts up the next row up are a little smaller. And then as you work up to the shoulder, there are multiple rows of lesser coverts, lesser secondary coverts that get smaller and smaller as you reach up to the shoulder. They sometimes along the leading edge refer to those as the marginal coverts. The other very important group to learn are the scapular feathers, and they cover a large area And they're sort of divided between the inner scapulars or upper scapulars, which are small, and the lower scapulars, outer scapulars, which are large. And you can see how much of the wing or the upper parts they take up, and they can actually drop over the wing coverts. So you only see the greater coverts or the median coverts. And sometimes the contour feathers, pale on this semi-palmated, can cover up some of the coverts as well. So just get yourself familiar, look at photographs, good photos of shorebirds, and just start practicing on the feather groups. Tedious, yes, but perhaps like a math equation might be fun. Calls for nearly all shorebird species are diagnostic, and particularly between some similar species. They vary. Shorebirds give a number of different calls for different purposes, and when they get up on the breeding grounds, many of them have exotic songs that you never hear in migration or the winter grounds. The variety of dowitcher calls is quite astounding, really, and those you can hear in migration in winter. I hear most of them these days, which is encouraging, despite getting a little older and losing the high-end hearing. Some, like a Baird's or a pectoral sandpiper, really stand out as being different. Shorebird calls can be very important for taxonomic reasons too. We considered at AOS splitting the subspecies of Whimbrel this year. One significant hesitation were the vocalizations, which seem to be identical between Eurasian Whimbrels and North American Whimbrels, despite some aspects of appearance, like white in the rump, lower back of Eurasian birds.
There are 7 species of stints and peeps worldwide. All 7 have been recorded in North America, but only 3 are regulars in North America, and 2 are commonly found in California. North American birders like calling the small calidris peeps, whereas British birders call them stints. We'll start with our 2 most common species, western and least. A lot of people are told to focus on the leg color, but often this is difficult to see. Instead, look at the clear differences in plumage coloration, which are particularly obvious in basic plumage, as is shown here. Note here that there is a western up front and a least in the background. The least sandpiper is the smallest shorebird in the world, with a short, thin, and slightly decurved bill. It appears exceptionally small in flight, where its short wings are apparent. The primary tip projection past the tertials is extremely short or non-existent. In all plumages, least is comparatively darker than western. Least sandpipers winter throughout much of California, including in the interior areas. Spring migration usually ends by late April. In fall, adults arrive by July 1st, and for juveniles by August 1st. Least sandpipers tend to feed farther away from the water than other peeps, but of course there's overlap between species. Their call is rather high and slightly upslurred. Moving on to the different plumages of least sandpiper. Alternate adults have a brownish plumage and a streaked chest with no streaks extending down to the sides. Juveniles are more richly colored above, with a buffy wash across a diffusely streaked breast. Basic plumaged adults are brown above and brownish across the breast. Least and westerns are easiest to distinguish in this plumage, as one is brown and the other is gray. Once again, you'll note on all plumages that primary tip projection is basically non-existent. Western sandpipers are larger and grayer than least in all plumages, with longer wings and a short primary projection past the tertials. They have long and slightly decurved bills that gradually get thinner near the tip. Western sandpipers are a very common migrant throughout California and from April to mid-May and from the end of June to mid-October. They winter locally on the coast at large tidal estuaries and are very local inland, numerous only at the Salton Sea and Owens Lake, and some in San Joaquin Valley. The first southbound adults come through by the end of June, and the first juveniles by the end of July, with the great majority coming through during August and all through September. Western sandpipers usually feed in shallow water on the shore's edge, probing like a dunlin. Their calls are much scratchier and somewhat harsher than that of laced, and less upslurred. Alternate adults have extensive rufous red on the face, back, and inner scapulars, and are heavily marked with arrow-shaped streaks across the breast and down to the sides and flanks. Juveniles, on the other hand, have lots of rufous red in the inner scapulars, and the upper parts are largely colorful and freshly edged. Below they are white and mostly unmarked. When juvenile plumage is fresh, there appears to be a buffy wash across the chest. In basic plumage, westerns are grayish above and white below with fine streaking across the breast. Laced and westerns are most easy to distinguish when they are in basic plumage. I have discussed our two most common species because I've taken the time to get to know them well. While putting together this presentation, John promised that he would cover those species that I have not yet seen, so he'll be talking about the rarity people often look for, semi-palmated sandpiper. But before passing it on to him, I would like to note that I do think that knowing least and western will prepare me for when I finally do get to see a semi-palmated, hopefully sometime soon, and not only to just view the bird, but to better understand it. And before I move on, if you aren't fully convinced, seeing them side by side makes evident the clear differences in coloration. Especially look how different they are in basic plumage. One is brown with a brown wash across the chest, and the other is gray above and white underneath. So hopefully you can see that it is not necessary to see the color of the legs to distinguish the two.
Well, thank you, Laura. We've done 2 of the 7 species of stints or peeps. If you have trouble remembering the number, just think of the 7 deadly stints, and that might help you come up with that, the number 7. And I'd like to add, when I was birding with Laura and her father one day at San Joaquin Marsh, there was a flock of peeps, and her dad said, well, those are hopeless. And I said, oh, I disagree. And we took a bit of time and just relaxed with them. They were close. And within 15 minutes, he said, oh, they're not hard at all. So if you look at them the right way, get close, don't have too many, and look at them carefully, they're not that hard. And I consider learning least and western as an absolute must before you start thinking about rare species. And the most regular of the rare species is the other North American peep or stint, the semi-palmated sandpiper. Now it's pretty widespread over 2/3 of North America, but in California, they're basically a rarity. Most regular, we see juveniles in the fall. And the timing of those is the last week of July and up to about the middle of August, a few to late August. Now we're down to individuals into September and a couple of October records. But sometimes the first peeps, as the first peeps come south in late July, look critically at them, because sometimes the first 10 you might see include a semi-palmated, even from counties where there aren't that many records. Be especially alert last few days of July, first half of August. Again, remember, chance favors the prepared mind. So structure and appearance, the semi-palmated looks rather chunky overall, with a rounded head, less of a block-headed appearance that Western has. Larger, plumper than least, a little bit of primary projection, unlike least, certainly paler than least, paler below, and juvenile and basic plumage. They, the very best field mark is the bill, which is tubular, almost sort of plover-like. Now keep in mind, females have slightly longer bills, and clinally, as you go west to east, bills lengthen, say, as you head towards eastern North America, and particularly Labrador. The important thing is what you are likely to see in California are going to be birds out of Alaska. They breed all the way west to the Seward Peninsula, and they have the shortest bills, thus they're going to be the most distinctive. There are a few in spring, May is the best month for that, but they're always very rare then, and also very rare in the fall, the end of June to perhaps the middle of August are adults. We see primarily juveniles. Now, behaviorally wise, they can be out in the shallow water with the westerns. They do more picking at the water surface, not the probing that westerns do. And remember, the leasts are back often well from the water's edge, but all of them overlap a bit. But hopefully, you know leasts and westerns so well that when you finally find your semi-palmated, you're right on it. The call is short and rather low, a low chirk, quite unlike the scratchy notes of westerns and the high thin call of least. So what I'd like you to look at, notice there's, by the way, no shot of a winter plumage semi-palmated. The plumage is unknown in California. We see juveniles and breeding adults, either worn in July or fresher in May. But lock in on the bill, short, rather stubby, tubular, thick at the tip of fairly uniform thickness throughout. And most of the semi-palmateds again will be in juvenile plumage. The comparison to western, look at the face. The face is a little darker with the supercilium more striking, darker in front of the eye. I'm being anthropomorphic, but they have kind of a meaner look. And they do sometimes bully other species that are near them, give them a good jab. They're more uniform above. They're not as rufous on the inner scapulars like a western, and the covert's overall a little darker, so giving again a more uniform appearance. An alternate plumage similar to western, but lacking the bright rufous tones on the inner scapulars, crown, ear coverts, and the streaking underneath is less extensive and finer. Remember, adults are very rare in California. Next image. So let's compare an alternate western and an alternate semi-palmated. You can see the bright rufous coloring on the western, rufous at the base of the scapulars, somewhat darker, more uniform appearance in the semi-palmated. Notice on westerns how the bill thins near the tip and is fine at the tip, where semi-palmateds are a little thicker throughout. The face patterns comparing the juveniles. And when you think you have a semi-palmated, it's say you're with a flock of 50 birds, you always want to be able to refine what you think is a semi-palmated. If the flock flies, reshuffles, and you can't find your semi-palmated, that's a major warning sign. Here's comparisons now with semi-palmated and least. Notice the somewhat darker appearance of the least and the totally different bill shape. I've seen folks they really learn the westerns and then a least comes into the picture and they jump for semi-palmated, but you really want to look at that stubby tubular bill of the semi-palmated. The first thing to look at. Notice comparing the juveniles, the juvenile least is streaked across the chest, and the semi-palmated, and when fresh, can have a buffy wash across the breast, but is similar to western in being largely unmarked, unlike least. And remember, we don't have a winter bird because we don't see that plumage. I've seen it on the Gulf Coast, early migrants in late March, and I've seen it in November in Texas, and that one was in basic plumage. They do winter, a few in the Yucatan and a few in South Florida, but no winter records for California.
Sanderlings are much larger than both least and western sandpipers and have a short, thick, and straight bill. They also lack hind toes, unlike the other smaller calidris. Sanderlings winter commonly on the coast. They are rare interior migrants from May and mid-July to mid-August as adults and from late August until early October as juveniles. They are casual inland in winter, except at the Salton Sea where they can be rare and local. Sanderlings show the distinctive behavior of running back and forth with advancing and retreating waves on beaches. but some will also feed more regularly, like other species, on lagoons and ponds where this unique behavior is less apparent. Their call is a sharp kip, not too unlike the call of a red-necked phalarope. Alternate adult plumage is usually acquired late in the spring, usually during May. The deep rufous red coloration of this plumage can be confused with that of the much smaller red-necked stint. Adults arrive in mid-July in this plumage. Juveniles are distinctive with blackish upper parts that are covered with numerous and highly contrasting white spots and are white below. This plumage is usually not seen in California until after August 20th. Adults in basic plumage are very pale, especially on the head. On this photo, we can see the dark on the shoulder, but under most circumstances, this dark patch is covered up.
I was just going to add, if you get a really good look at a sanderling, they lack a hind toe, which the other species we've discussed have. Maybe that enables them to speed quicker on the sandy beaches where they run routinely. And the running is a good field mark. Now, moving on to the red knot, I was always curious where the name knot came from. And when you're quizzing someone and they say, well, it's not that, and then you say, well, actually, anyway, you can play around with the word knot. But knot is believed to come from King Canute, a Viking ruler who variously ruled Great Britain, Denmark, and Norway till his death in 1035. It is said that he once went out with his followers, with his people, and looked at the tide going out and said he could not control the tides. Probably couldn't control where the shorebirds were either. So his name was King Canute. He died in 1035. But the red knot is quite local in California. They winter in large numbers around San Diego Bay, and smaller numbers around San Francisco Bay and other large tidal estuaries. They're more widespread as a migrant on the coast, of course. They're rare inland at any time except at the Salton Sea, where up to 600 have been seen in migration in April. Mostly the mid to late April, some into early May. And they're regular at Salton Sea in fall as well. Adults in mid-July and on to mid-August. Juveniles arrive by the end of August. Casual anywhere else inland in California, always a great find. They associate on mudflats with other calidris, not so much out in the water, often can be found on the beaches too, and they pick at the substrate. Red knots seem to be largely silent. I seldom hear them give a call when they're here in the winter and in migration. Maybe it gets lost with the other shorebirds, which they often associate with. Alternate adult red knots are very beautiful, the way we can see them in the spring. Maybe somewhat like a dowitcher, but with a disproportionately shorter bill, shorter legs. They appear rather squat, kind of chunky. Adults are highly colored underneath with paler vent and undertail. The juvenile plumage is very distinctive in that all the feathers above have subterminal dark fringes with a paler fringe. When fresh, a buffy wash across the breast. Some red knots are highly migratory, but overall the primary projection is rather long. So this is a good chance to practice again our feather topography. We have notice how the wingtips, the primaries are blackish and extend well behind the three tertials we can see. Primaries extend beyond the tail slightly too. And then always remember the next three feathers up, or the next group of feathers up from the tertials, are the greater secondary coverts. And from the cropping on this photo, you can see the median, or at least the tips of the median secondary coverts right up along the left image of the photo. Basic plumage, knots, they really don't, they're just basically gray, but easily told by structure. A bit of a pale eyebrow too is always a good mark. Look at the shorter legs, rather plump, and the overall color, they'll show some whitish in the rump when they fly. Most places in California, red knot is always a fairly exciting find and can be easily confused. So particularly in areas where they're relatively numerous, it's a good species to learn. Moving on to the Baird sandpiper. It and the sparrow, the Baird sparrow, are named after Spencer Fullerton Baird, one of the first curators of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and started up the bird collection. He also recognized the brilliance of what, in my opinion, is America's greatest ornithologist, Robert Ridgway. Note there's no E after the G. Perhaps America's greatest ornithologist. Baird was tireless and trying to build the collection and worked well with others. But the sandpiper named after him has a very distinctive structure, very long-winged. It's a trans-equatorial migrant, long primary projection past the tertials, overall rather buffy or brownish. It's overall a somewhat scarce species in California, rare in the spring. Adults are very uncommon to rare in the fall, in July, early August, and what we see primarily are juveniles in August and particularly the first half of September, well, really much of September, a few into October. They tend to feed either in shallow water, shore's edge, or even well away from the water's edge, well up on the mud flats where they pick at the surface. Will even turn up on turf farms. So here are the plumages we see. If you're lucky, you'll see an adult on the right. And the plumage to learn is the juvenile on the left. And look at the scaly appearance. Those fringes on all the feathers of the upper parts completely go around the tip of the feather. So sometimes that's shorebird terminology. You'll notice that we'll say the fringes if the edge goes all the way around the feather, as opposed to edge, where the dark tip of the feather breaks the pale stripe off the edge of the feather. Behind the primary tip projection, which goes in Baird's well past the tail, and then you can see the other groups of feathers, which are patterned more similarly with the fringes. You give a buffy coloration. Yes, they have dark legs, but we always try to tutor people away from not getting focused on the legs, that legs can get stained a particular color. So a much rarer species in California is the white rump sandpiper. It's one of the most highly migratory of all shorebirds. They winter in southern South America. For instance, they're common along with the highly migratory Hudsonian godwit, Tierra del Fuego. They migrate primarily in the eastern half of North America in spring. In fall, their migration is more easterly. Many migrate over the Atlantic back to South America. Interestingly, all of the records for California of some 30, most of which are in very late spring, but they're of adults. There are no records of juveniles, to my knowledge, anywhere in the West. I'm not even sure there are any for the Great Plains. And that's very interesting because you think of juveniles as more likely to stray. They're much like Bairds in behavior, along the shore or into shallow water, not so much away from the water, picking at the surface. Yes, they do, or nearly all have a white rump, but that's visible only in flight. So here's an adult in basic plumage, and some of the individuals seen on their southbound fall migration look like that. The spring birds are what we see in California. Again, note the long primary tip projection past the tertials, wings extending past the tail. That gives them a rather horizontal stance to the ground. The juvenile plumage, I've seen very few of. The farthest west I've seen a juvenile was in Mobile Bay, Alabama. I have seen them in other juveniles. I've seen them in Maine, but overwhelmingly I've just seen alternate adults and some in basic plumage. The call of white rump is distinctive. In particular, I can't hear it anymore. It's too high pitched. a very high-pitched seat, very totally different from Baird's, which it's shaped like. Genetically, they're not, the two species aren't closely related.
So we're going to close out with my very favorite calidris and my very favorite species of bird in general. The geographic variation of dunlins is fascinating to me, and I'll elaborate a little more on this in the next slide. During winter, when we see dunlins, they are a grayish-brown with a decurved bill, somewhat resembling that of an oversized least sandpiper. The dunlin is a worldwide subpolar breeder with 10 subspecies. It winters north of the equator from West Africa across the Middle East to Southeast Asia and south to Mexico and rarely to Central America. When feeding, dunlins typically probe in shallow water, much like a western sandpiper. And before I go on, here's a beautiful alternate adult Pacifica, which we see before they leave in spring. On this slide are the two North American subspecies, or they winter in North America, Pacifica and Hudsonia. Also on this slide is my very, very favorite subspecies and my favorite bird, the subspecies Arctica. I've made silhouettes on the bottom from photos and scaled them to help you visualize the extreme differences in structure and size, particularly with the birds on the left and the right. Pacifica is the largest subspecies that we see here on the Pacific coast during winter. Hudsonia, slightly smaller than Pacifica, winters on the eastern Gulf Coast. To me, Hudsonia seems a little grayer and shows more streaks than Pacifica in basic plumage. Finally, Arctica is the smallest out of all the subspecies. It is an endemic breeder to northeast Greenland and winters in coastal West Africa. In winter plumage, it does not even look like a dunlin, at least not the way we have them here. When I first learned of this bird, I was shocked by how different it was from the other dunlins. This difference was further impressed upon me when I learned of the differences in the timing of molt between these two groups of dunlin, specifically how Arctica and Shinzy molt once they arrive on the wintering grounds, whereas our dunlins molt closer to the breeding grounds. Someday, I hope that I'll be able to study this topic and see Arctica in real life.
Thank you, Laura. I guess we're ready for questions.
Yeah, thank you, John and Laura, for your presentation. I hope everybody learned a lot about shorebird ID and is encouraged to go out and go see some shorebirds and try to identify them and really appreciate them, because I know they can be challenging for so many people, and especially in the winter. You know, we'll get a lot more of them here, and it's a great time to really practice those shorebird ID skills. So I know that we already have some questions in the chat, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in here. So the first question that I saw was from Pete. For the semi-palmated sandpipers, what's the biological basis for them having longer bills as you go east?
That's a great question. And I'm not prepared to answer why females have longer bills than males. But I've seen semi-palmated sandpipers on the East Coast, and the difference can be fairly startling when you see a long-billed semi-palmated. It doesn't really droop or thin near the tip like a Western. And of course, you can still do them on plumage because you're seeing juveniles and adults. The basic plumages between the two are pretty similar and best told by structure. But if you're seeing a really long-billed female semi-palmated sandpiper on the East Coast, it can be fairly alarming. But why it's longer on the East Coast and how that developed evolutionary, I'm not prepared to give an answer because it would be a total guess, but you have a few very experienced people in the audience, I think. I'd certainly welcome any conjecture on their part.
All right, I'll see if anybody ends up chiming in on that. But the next question is from Maureen, who says that it sounds like the juveniles we see early in the year molt their body feathers into basic plumage after they get here. Do the adults also arrive in alternate plumage and molt their body feathers after they arrive? Yeah,
that's something perhaps we should have addressed. With most species, and we're speaking of fall now, both the adults and the juveniles arrive in either alternate plumage or juvenile plumage. And for those that are transequatorial, they're carried through in that plumage. Sometimes they'll have a suspended molt. Obviously, for adults like Western that winter on the coast, you're going to see them, both the adults and the juveniles, molt. So the adults arrive first fall. They arrive by late June, the juveniles by late July, in the case of Western Sandpiper. And when you're used to ratty, worn adult Western Sandpipers, all through July, when you see the first juvenile at the end of the month, all fresh, every feather is brand new, lacking all those marks underneath, it's really quite a beautiful experience.
And then related to that, Maureen continued, I assume the juveniles keep their first set of flight feathers all through the winter. When do the adults get a new set of flight feathers in the fall? Is that before, during, or after migration?
After, except for Dunlin, which molts near the breeding grounds or at particularly favored staging areas, not that far from the breeding grounds. So by the time we see Dunlins here in the South, they're already both adults and juveniles at basic plumage. That may be one of the reasons that, and the differences between Dunlin populations, that stimulates Laura's great interest in the topic. Apart from, she's picked one of the more remote places on Earth in which she wants to do her graduate studies, Northeast Greenland. Laura, do you want to start fundraising for your, maybe you have to go through, no, they have flights to Greenland directly from New York. Of course, despite attempts to purchase Greenland, Greenland belongs to Denmark.
I just have to say, I'm already impressed that you know at this early what you want to do for grad school. It took me years to figure that out. So the next question is from Wally. Why do juveniles have a different migration pattern compared to adults?
Okay, it's a good question. They're all good questions. It seems juveniles have a broader path of migration. For instance, pectorals, virtually everything we see in California are juveniles in the fall. The adults, some of them have come from central Siberia, and they migrate to the Ohio, Mississippi valleys and then go south all the way to Argentina. Whereas juveniles migrate through on a broader front. And as I sort of tried to detail, on the other hand, white rump sandpiper, the juveniles have a narrower path of migration, at least for the few white rumps that migrate through the interior east seem to be mostly adults, particularly say east of Ohio, or rather west of Ohio. One Asian species, the adults, the sharp-tailed sandpiper, the adults have an interior migration largely through Asia, where the juveniles flee to the coast, the Bering Sea. You see so many in Western Alaska, and most of the few we see on the West Coast are juveniles. So each species has its own fascinating divergent thing we can talk about, which is one of the things you keep learning about shorebirds, and all of the work being done with geolocators and where they go and the migrations. We're going to learn a lot more about this in the years and decades to come, long after I'm gone.
Yeah, definitely. So always so much more to learn. The next question is from Pete. So some Western sandpipers are transequatorial migrants. Has anyone looked at the wing length of those individuals versus those that don't migrate as far?
Good question. I don't have an answer to that. I know that on a passer, Townsend's warbler, that Grinnell studied that the birds that migrate to Middle America in the winter, as opposed to those that winter, have slightly longer primaries. I believe Grinnell even had a subspecies name coined if it were to be recognized on that basis alone, which it never was. So it wouldn't surprise me, but I'm not aware of any studies on that. But I'm happy to be corrected, or someone can put in the chat if there are.
All right, and then our next question is from David. Are there any differences between least sandpipers and Western sandpipers in their flocking behavior and flight behavior?
You know, it brings up an interesting point. When you see a shorebird fly, and a whole bunch of peeps get up and fly, they'll sort of all be together. And then as they begin to realize they're not going to get eaten by the peregrine, the leaves will separate out. So sometimes finding a shorebird that's slightly apart from the others might give it a look, because it could be a different species. But the first to panic, they're all together. You know, it's the school of fish with a hungry shark after them. And keeping close to your companion can be a lifesaver.
And then here's a Dunlin question. So Terrence says, I love the Dunlin's dark belly. Are there any other shorebirds that have that dark belly?
Offhand, I'm thinking of black-bellied plover. Not a calidris, I don't think, but any other shorebirds, John?
None that I can think of, not like that. That's what makes the alternate plumage so distinctive of Dunlin. And remember, we don't see the alternate plumage in fall. So that's something to appreciate before they go north in April and May. So don't miss them then to see the beautiful, and an alternative English name that's been used is the redback sandpiper. They have a bright rufous back, particularly with our Pacifica.
Nice, we'll have to wait till they return. So Karen says that last winter, there was a cooperative curlew sandpiper here in Palo Alto. Can you comment on that type of sandpiper in comparison to some of these others you've discussed?
Well, it wasn't cooperative for me. I think I looked for it 5 times, but when it was there, it was cooperative. And yeah, that's very interesting. But curlew sandpiper has wintered in Southern Europe too, but most are migrate much farther south. So the fact that this one wintered, and one wintered in the San Joaquin Valley in Kings Kern County, maybe more than 1 year. So it returned. Curlew structurally is very similar to Dunlin. The bill is a little thinner, longer, a little more sharply decurved. The legs are a little longer, well, more than a little longer, rather strikingly longer than the Dunlin. Our Dunlin are pretty brown-chested Pacifica in winter. Curlews are paler overall. And except for the wintering bird, when we see the few curlew sandpipers we see, they're either alternate adults or juvenile plumage, which is all fringed above, very different from a Dunlin. So yeah, there's a lot of things to look at a curlew sandpiper, and I was keen to look at all of them, but it didn't happen. Of course, they have a white rump in flight, unlike a Dunlin, which is dark.
Right, hopefully when the next one comes, you'll definitely see that one.
No whining, no whining. And I would want to add also, you know, a bit of Zen meditation, not that I practice that, as you approach these shorebirds. Don't panic, just relax with them, get as close as you can, and absorb yourself into their environment as much as you can. I think that really facilitates learning. Don't listen to frenetic music either in advance. Do something that'll mellow you out. A good dose of Leonard, perhaps.
All right, and then our next question goes back to Dunlin. So Pamela asks, how long does it take for the Dunlin Antarctica species, or Arctica species, I'm sorry, to migrate from Greenland to West Africa? That distance seems so vast.
That's a great question, and I'm not quite sure of the answer to that. Not a lot is known about Arctica, actually. For instance, the winter plumage is very poorly known in what they do in West Africa. So it would be something I would be interested in looking into, but I don't have an answer at this moment.
One of the most talented field ornithologists in the world, he combines that with being an absolutely outstanding illustrator, is Killian Mullarney. You might guess from his last name that he's Irish, and that's correct. And he lives and studies, looks at Dunlin in West Ireland, you know, on the coast, and that's where the Arcticas come through. They pass through Iceland. So he knows that subspecies pretty well and is keen to learn much more from his experiences in the coast of Ireland. They're pretty scarce, England, Scotland, and then they migrate to West Africa, and typically probably most of them south of Morocco, where few go. So that's why they're poorly known in the winter on the winter grounds. Just reaching the breeding grounds has huge logistical issues, northeastern Greenland. So, and perhaps they could be, Greenland is under some environmental threats. So species, subspecies, by the way, it's a subspecies with a fairly small overall population.
Yeah, I recall that there are only, I think it was a couple thousand, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, remember it and Shenzi are the two that break the norm. Maybe some Nominate alpina too. So they migrate south in breeding and juvenile plumage. I think, Laura, weren't you just so astounded when you were shown a picture of a Dunlin? It was Arctica, and you just couldn't believe it was the same species as the biggest Dunlins. Remember, we have the biggest Dunlins, Pacifica. And
Yeah, when I finally knew the size difference when I was doing the little silhouettes, and also most striking was the difference in the winter plumage or basic plumage, because it looks almost like one of our smaller peeps, like maybe like a Western or something. Like, it is not like a Dunlin, so I was absolutely shocked, and it's a beautiful bird.
the British literature would always say you could confuse Western sandpiper with a Dunlin, and I thought, on what planet do they live? And they're so experienced. But of course, they were referring to the smaller Shenzi and the very small Arctica. The difference in size isn't that dramatic with the next, with the Western. And the behavioral Western and Dunlin feed in a similar manner too. So they could see an Arctica with a larger alpina and think, oh, maybe I have a Western sandpiper, but they're saying an Arctica Dunlin. That makes sense.
I'm sure, Laura, we got to get you to Greenland to study them, right? So we'll learn so much more about that, relatively mysterious subspecies from you in the future. So it is just past 7 now. So I do want to just give you a heads up about that. We do have a couple of more questions in the chat, if you don't mind sticking on for just a couple of minutes to answer those.
There, before we let Laura go, Laura, do you want to talk about your screensaver in the background?
Oh, right. This is a surf bird. Bob gave it to me, and it was done by a Russian artist. And I have a couple others. There's like a yellow legs and some sort of plover that I don't recall right now.
That's beautiful. And then do you also want to just like really quickly explain who Bob is for those who don't know?
I think Bob is here. Bob Gill. Yeah, he is here. He does a lot of work on shorebirds, and he was very kind in answering a lot of my questions when I was putting together the Dunlin presentation, especially with the species that breed in Alaska, Arcticula, which I will always remember the pronunciation of now, and Pacifica. And I find them quite interesting because one goes off to Asia for the winter, and the other Pacifica comes here to the Pacific coast. So, but they breed both in Alaska, so very interesting.
Yeah, it's always so fascinating to me, just migration ecology and how birds breeding in the same places can go to such different places. And it's also great to hear that you are having so much support from all these great mentors in your journey to becoming this great ornithologist. So always happy to hear about that.
I'm very grateful to all of them.
Yeah. So the last couple of questions I'm seeing here, one is from Jan. What is the function of calls in Calidris? For wintering birds in California, are the calls mainly contact calls, or is there something else going on?
The latter. As to how they all figure out. But you'll hear, there are contact calls, species-specific calls, the scratchy low note of the Dunlin. But when you watch a feeding flock in action, there are all these little chirring sounds. And when they jab at each other, they get a little more heightened, and the other guy getting jabbed might have a responsive, a protest. And then of course, then you get into the songs and all the functions of what the songs is. When you get up to the Arctic breeding grounds, you hear a whole lot of different sounds you've never heard anywhere else on these birds. And many of those sounds are delivered in elaborate flight displays, or in the case of yellowlegs, from tops of trees. It's like all of your previous experiences are relevant from the way you see what they do when they breed.
Oh, interesting. And then the last question I'm seeing in the chat right now is from Yvonne. Do you happen to know if for stable isotope analysis from feathers, does that change for each molt if the molts are in different geographic areas, such as, if a bird is molting north versus south? Do you happen to know the answer to that?
I do not, but I was very curious, and perhaps someone could chime in. When they looked at slenderbill curlew specimens, old world species, now likely extinct, they're able, from the isotopes, to determine where they likely bred. The only known nests were Southwest Siberia, but they figure most of the population bred in Kazakhstan. So sure, they're excellent. There's a lot of information, but not that I have followed. Laura, have you come across anything in your readings on? You've read a lot of papers, I haven't.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm reading a paper, I tend to focus on the information I want to get out of it. But I do recall coming across that method of looking at feathers. And I remember something about being able to look into their diets possibly with that, and also where in the world they are approximately, but I don't really know very much about it. And I would like to read a lot more about it. I mean, there's a whole lot of things I want to read all on my bookshelf, but seems to be a never-ending battle with trying to diminish my reading list and having time to do that. So
yeah, there's just so much out there to learn, right? So and actually, Yvonne, it might be a good idea to maybe attend our August talk on the Bird Genostate Project, because some of the early stages involve some stable isotope analysis with bird feathers. So our speaker then might know the answer to it. So hopefully you can join us in a couple months.
Looking forward to learning.
Yeah. So I think that was the last question. I'm seeing lots of thank yous and comments in the chat. So thank you again, everybody, so much for joining us. And thank you, John and Laura, for your great and informative talk. So I guess I'll start with John. Is there anything you want to say to everybody here first before we sign off?
No, just thank you, Serena. Thanks for having us. Thanks for supporting Laura getting the Greenland Fund. Of course, I'm she's a long ways off from that, but it's always a pleasure and to be part of a project for the San Francisco Bay, SFPBO.
Thank you, John. And then Laura, is there anything you want to add or share with everybody?
I just want to say thank you to everyone who came and everybody I reached out to, especially, and also thank you to John, and thank you to my other mentor, Jillian Martin, and all the people who have helped me and supported me with learning about birds, and also with school as well, making decisions with all of that. So thank you.